This is Arnold Michaelis. On December 18, 1957, I visited with Richard Rodgers at his apartment in New York. Regarded by much of the world as America's best-loved composer, Mr. Rodgers achieved this distinction by providing the music for the lyrics by two men, each of whom was both his good friend and constant collaborator. First, Lawrence Hart, and since 1942, Oscar Hammerstein II. The history of the American musical play during the past 35 years is largely the story of Dick Rodgers, and our conversation ranged over some of those memorable milestones of another day, like A Connecticut Yankee, The Garrick Gaieties, and Dearest Enemy.
These shows that you're now talking about occurred very, very early in our lives. See, the Garrick Gaieties was before my 23rd birthday.
Well, Dick, it's rather remarkable to look back over this whole panorama of your life since the age of 23, when you suddenly became a success. What did that do to a boy of 23, as you remember it?
Well, I think I was very lucky, Arnold. I came from a middle-of-the-road family, financially.
Yes.
There was enough to send my brother and me through college, enough to send me to the Institute of Musical Art. We never had to worry about the next meal, so that I didn't have to leap at the wrong thing to help support my family or to support myself. I had backing, which made it comfortable. On the other hand, we weren't so poor that sudden money threw me off balance.
Good point.
Which is a good thing. I've seen this happen to people, especially in the moving picture business, who suddenly stumble over thousands of dollars a week and go insane. It's too much. They don't know how to handle it. And they know the value of a dollar in reverse. A dollar doesn't represent so many pounds of meat or so many pairs of shoes. It represents so many tires for the Thunderbird.
Well, I'm sure you have to charge a lot of it off to what you call the middle-of-the-road family.
Well, you get thrown into a series of cliches now, you see. Like being grateful for everything, which I am. You know, even the cliche has a right to be true.
It's only a cliche because originally it was true.
That's right. So you're 55 years old and living comfortably, and nobody interferes with your work or your living, and you're grateful for it. And out of gratitude, you don't push people around. You don't throw your weight around any more than you can help, and you can usually help it. And out of the same sense of gratitude, you try as hard as you can to help other people.
Dick, about Larry, you've been quoted as saying this: "In one afternoon, I acquired a career, a partner, a best friend, and a source of permanent irritation." Did you ever make that statement?
I wrote it.
You made it. What were the circumstances of that first meeting that you had with Larry? Do you remember?
Yes, I remember them very, very well. A man by the name of Philip Levitt went to Columbia. He was a contemporary of my brother's. In other words, about 5 years older than I was. Mm-hmm. Phil knew my music, what there was of it, and thought I needed a lyric writer. He knew Larry's lyrics and thought that Larry needed a composer, a kind of a two-way agent. And he told me about Larry and told Larry about me. And one Sunday afternoon, he took me up to meet Larry. And we climbed the brownstone stoop, and Larry came to the door wearing house slippers, a pair of tuxedo trousers, it's a Sunday afternoon, and some kind of shirt. And he needed a shave. But Larry always needed a shave, except on rare state occasions. And Larry ushered Phil and me into his parlor, his mother and father's parlor.
He was then, what, about 23?
Larry was 23 years old, yes, I was 16. Mm-hmm. Of course, to me, Larry was the old man of the mountains, this great, sophisticated old man. And I was a naive child. But I wasn't so naive that I didn't know that I was in the presence of talent. Because what Larry had to say about lyrics, and the making of lyrics, and the relationship of lyrics to the theater was exciting to me and tremendously stimulating. I didn't know the real meaning of interior rhymes. It had never occurred to me that lyrics could go for their subject matter beyond the confines of what was then popular. In other words, the most superficial, awkward, unemotional level of popular songwriting The only thing we had in those days that came near what Larry was talking about was the Bolton, Wodehouse, and Kern shows. Oh boy, old lady, very good Eddie, things like that. They weren't the mythical kingdom sort of thing, with the fake prince who turns out to be a real prince when he marries the milliner.
Yes.
That was what we got up to that
Well, that
point.
was Romberg and Frimmel and Herbert.
Oh, and even before that, they came from Vienna.
Yeah.
And Kern, you see, as a composer, made the jump. The forerunner to Gershwin, who had a little of the Viennese school by way of England, into the American school. And then, eventually, Kern picked up the American scene in his music and forgot the European. Just as a painter has to pick up colors that belong to someone else, but he uses them his own way.
His own wonderful analogy.
He becomes his own painter of his own scene.
Well, now, Kern had become quite an idol to you, hadn't he, by the time you met Larry?
Oh, yes. My goodness, if you were at all sensitive to music, Kern had to be your idol. You had to worship Kern.
But we've left Larry in his bedroom slippers, his tuxedo trousers, and an unidentifiable shirt back at the age of 23.
Well, we left him with something even more important than the way he was dressed physically. It was the way his mind was dressed. And that was pretty attractive.
How did you come to grips with it that afternoon? Do you remember specifically?
Well, I played things of mine. And apparently he liked my things as much as I liked his. And we hit it off wonderfully. And while we did no work that afternoon, we decided then and there that we would try to work together. We did go to work immediately. We wrote a lot of songs, most of which were never used.
Do you remember the first song that you did with him?
No, I don't. I remember that one of the songs I did with him was the first song we ever had done professionally, and the first published song. It's the first song in the Rodgers and Hart songbook. It's a thing called Any Old Place With You.
Oh, I remember that, and I remember the lyric. I've got a mania for Pennsylvania.
Yes, that was one of this group that we did during those first few weeks of working with each other.
We'll meet in Syria and freeze in Siberia.
That's right.
Negligee in Timbuktu. In dreamy Portugal, I'm going to court you, girl.
Well, you have to sing
in
it.
dreamy Portugal.
Portugal, I'm going to court you.
I'm going to court you, gal.
It's very chic in those days. Oh, that was pretty hot stuff, that rhyme.
But these lines here get me. I'll call each Budapest you like in Budapest. Oh, for far Peru. Well, I don't think Peru was ever further than it was in this lyric. I'll go to hell for you in Philadelphia.
Or Philadelphia.
Or Philadelphia, any old place with you.
Yeah, that's right.
Dick, how did the music go?
Yep.
That's really back in when? 19...
Oh, dear, 18 to 19.
Well, now, this was about a year or two before you and Oscar got together for the first time in that Columbia...
That was in 1920.
1920.
Yeah.
In the Columbia Varsity Show of 1920. You and Larry did most of the songs, didn't you?
We did all except two. I did them all. I did all the tunes. And Oscar did two lyrics. One I don't remember, and the other was... There's always room for one more. A 2-4, we used to call them in those days, what was known as an icebreaker type. It went like that. It's not very good.
That's really of the period, isn't it?
Yeah, that was 1920.
Well, now, there really is a marked difference musically between that and the really outstanding song hit of Garrick Gaieties, which only occurred 5 years later, wasn't it? 5 years after the Varsity Show?
Yes, that's right. Manhattan.
That's so loaded with nostalgia for me and everybody else that what can you say about it? In looking at the lyrics of Manhattan, Dick, away from the music, it's interesting, too, the extension of Larry from Any Old Place With You, and yet he still kept some of the same ideas and formulas in Manhattan. I'm thinking here of where he says, and tell me what street compares with Mott Street in July. And we'll go to Greenwich, where modern men itch to be free.
Yes, well, this is inherent in his personality as a writer, and it's also true of the music. There are similarities in musical approach.
I'd like to go back for a little more nostalgia, and this is to 1927. And well, I remember that because I went to see the first performance, I think, of a Connecticut Yankee.
Oh, my.
My parents kept me up late that night, and it was quite a show. Again, I remember one tune in particular, which has, I think, a rather curious history. Didn't it stem, originally, the concept of the song stemmed from a French taxi ride?
Yes, it's the only time, actually, that we ever got an idea for nothing. We got this title when we were almost in a taxi accident with a couple of girls in Paris. And one of the girls said, "Oh, my heart stood still." And Larry said, "That's a very good song title." Of course, I wanted to kill him. This is a very near miss. But I was so shocked by his thinking of business at a time like that that I made a note of it. And then when we got to London a few weeks later, I found this note in a little black book. And without saying anything to Larry, wrote the tune. I called Larry in, you see, and I said, "Here's the tune for that title of yours." He said, "What title?" And I said, "My heart stood still." He said, "Oh, that's very good." I said, "Sure it is, it's yours." And I played the tune for him. He thought the tune was fine, and then wrote the rest of the lyric.
Well, apparently it was worth almost being killed for.
And still played.
Yeah, I should say it is. Well, Dick, this business of Larry being a source of irritation to you, his despondency, his feelings of insecurity, his feelings of being out of balance with a good bit of the world, that must have been a pretty frightening thing for you to handle, wasn't it?
Well, it wasn't so frightening as it was frustrating. It was difficult from a personal viewpoint because he was a very difficult man to handle. I don't mean difficult in the sense of being disagreeable, which he never was. Mm-hmm. He was a sweet man. He was a very good man. And when he got in trouble, your instinct was to get angry because it interfered with work. And you got angry, but not for very long. He was difficult to handle because he wasn't there very much. He'd disappear. I had an appointment to meet Larry for lunch one day, and he called it off. Had his maid phone to say he couldn't make it. And I couldn't establish contact with him for a week.
A week?
Yeah. And then one day he showed up. He met me at Tony's in 52nd Street for lunch. Needed a shave. He looked terrible. His face was bruised. And one side of his jaw was very badly swollen. It looked as though he had a golf ball in there. And he said, "After lunch, I'll tell you what happened to me." And he ordered scrambled eggs and coffee, things that were easy to eat, ice cream. And then I said, "Now tell me what happened." And he told me, the man arrived at his apartment late one afternoon with a letter of introduction from a mutual friend on the coast. And Larry saw him and invited him to stay for dinner. And the man had some cocktails and had some wine with dinner. And long about 10 o'clock, Larry thought the man ought to go home, showing signs. And he wouldn't go. So Larry, wanting to get him out of the apartment, because his mother was there, said, "Well, let's go downtown. We go someplace and have a drink." And they got down the sidewalk in front of Larry's apartment house. And Larry said to him, "Now, don't you think you better go home and sleep this off?" And this fellow called Larry a very dirty name and took a swing at him and hit him on the chin. And Larry went down, and the taxi drivers who were standing around waiting for fares formed a circle and watched. You know, Larry is a little bit of a fella, and he didn't have a chance. And finally, somebody broke it up, and the man disappeared. And a friend of Larry's, who happened to be there, took him to his house, afraid to take Larry back to his own apartment because he didn't want his mother to see all the blood, and put him to bed in his apartment. Well, Larry told me this story, and I had hoped that somebody called the police, you see, and they put this character in jail. And I said so. And Larry said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I feel sorry for him." And I said, "Why? Horrible guy. Why do you feel sorry for him?" And Larry said, "Well, I broke his wrist, knocked out 3 teeth, and kicked him where it hurt the most, and he won't be out of the hospital for a week. Larry wore elevator shoes, and they were weapons. Didn't make him very tall, but made him very dangerous, and he just crippled this fellow. But this was Larry's sense of drama, you see. He would make me feel awfully sorry for him, and angry, and then tell me what he did to the other guy.
He didn't do this often, did he?
No, but he was a very tough little fella, and in a way this is admirable.
Do you think it would have been possible for Larry to have been helped if he were on the scene now?
It would be possible. Whether Larry would ever submit to having help was always the question. He never would. Mm-hmm. He never did. I tried very hard to get him to have help, which he always refused. He would become panic-stricken at the idea.
But do you think he was conscious of the fact that he was, in a sense, destroying himself?
Yes, I think he was. But this was compulsive. He couldn't help it.
But you must have supplied, Dick, a certain sense of security to him.
Oh, I did. There's no question about that.
What a concoction of human being he must have been.
He was just about everything sewed up in a very small package.
How much of a change, Dick, did you feel in working with Oscar the very first time? Incidentally, how did you get to Oscar? What made you go to him, or did you go to him originally?
Yes, I went to him. I went to him, at least 2 years before Oklahoma.
What prompted you to?
The fact that I knew that this couldn't last with Larry. Larry was slipping very fast. And I had responsibilities. And as much as I regretted it, there was nothing I could do. I couldn't stop working myself because Larry couldn't be worked with. I had tremendous faith in Oscar. Oscar had had a bad time of it for many years. But I knew beyond argument about this enormous talent. And I felt that if something did happen to Larry, this was the logical direction for me to move in. I was in Philadelphia with a show that George Abbott and I did together. Mm-hmm. And just to give you an idea as to how far this thing had progressed with Larry, I wouldn't put my name on the show. I didn't write it. George and I co-produced it. And I wouldn't put my name on it as co-producer because things were getting sensitive in the Larry Hart area. And I didn't want to call attention to the fact that I was working away from Larry, because I thought that would be harmful. George and I were in Philadelphia together, working on Best Foot Forward, which is the name of the show. And Oscar's farm was and is quite near Philadelphia, in Doylestown. And I got a car one Sunday and drove down to his farm and told him that I was awfully worried about Larry and I was afraid he wouldn't be able to work very much longer. And I asked Oscar if he thought he'd be interested in collaborating with me. And he told me he was very much interested. Thought he'd like it. Thought we'd get on together. And we simply agreed that if and when the time came that Larry wasn't able to work, Oscar and I would work together. And this is simply, may I have the next dance?
Mm-hmm. Well, when did Green Grow the Lilacs come into the picture?
Green Grow the Lilacs came into the picture after By Jupiter. And at that point, the Guild thought that Larry and I would do the show for them, wanted us to. And by that time, Larry was not in condition to work. And I went to Oscar and asked him if he would be interested in doing a musical version of Green Grow the Lilacs with me. He said he would. Then I went to the Guild and said that I wanted to work with Oscar, and that was fine with them. And we started writing what later turned out to be Oklahoma.
Well, now here you really had a complete departure from any work habits that you had established with Larry, because Oscar is such a meticulous and punctual kind of individual, even though he may take an awful lot of time and spend a lot of time in developing a lyric. But this must have really been a completely different planet for you, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. The whole thing was a new experience. Almost invariably, I had to write the music first with Larry. But with Oscar, I would say 66% of the time, Oscar did the lyrics first. Still does.
Well, now, you know, in connection with a song like June is Bustin' Out All Over, You're supposed to have written that music between the time Dorothy took your two children to the movies and when she came home.
Yes, but possibly Dorothy and the children didn't tell you how much thinking I'd been doing with that title for weeks and months before that afternoon that she went to the movies with the kids. An impression's created that Oscar bleeds over these things for weeks and weeks at a time, then turns the completed lyric over to me, and I dash the tune off in 5 minutes. Well, it just doesn't happen that way. I have to do an awful lot of thinking for an awful lot of time before I even dream of doing actual notes. I think that the moment of creation should be a spontaneous one. I think possibly the results are better if it comes in a rush. But you can't get that rush going without doing something about it. It isn't just there. You have to think. There is a thought process. This is not an instinctive thing like sneezing. I've never believed that a great composer had a deep emotional experience at 5 o'clock on Thursday, and at 8 o'clock on Thursday wrote 64 deathless bars.
How do you think it happened?
Well, I think that this experience at 5 o'clock on Thursday goes into his personality, becomes part of him, and is eventually expressed if he has a technique, if he has a means of expression. Eventually this finds its way out.
Well, now this borders on a subject that you kidded quite a bit in an article you wrote some years ago for Theater Arts Monthly. Do you remember on the question of inspiration that so many people asked you about how you were inspired to write all these beautiful melodies? And you rather poo-pooed the popular concept of inspiration.
Which I do today. You know, you fall in love.
At 5 o'clock one bright afternoon.
At 5 o'clock, and you don't sleep all that night, and you bounce up out of bed and grab a pencil and do something deathless. I don't believe it. I think this is a phony word.
You mean inspiration?
Yes. Encompasses too much. It says too much and says nothing. It's lost its meaning.
All right, let's look at it from the standpoint of this meaning. The term inspiration not only has to do with the reception of heavenly gifts, as we might define it, it also has to do with breathing.
Well, it's the drawing in of air.
All right. Can you relate the drawing in to the problem of doing
Yes,
something?
I can relate the drawing in, but the connotation of the word inspiration today means the giving out. It means the composition, whether it's on canvas or whether it's on a piece of paper. It's almost come to mean something divine, something occult, something over which we have no control. I don't believe this. I think if you express something over which you have no control, you have no art.
That's right. Art is controlled or disciplined.
That's right. You know, the best definition of art there is the expression of an emotion by means of a technique.
Excellent.
Take this apart. What's emotional? A truck driver screaming at a taxi driver is emotional. Not very artistic. Now we need technique to finish the thing off. Well, a bookkeeper is technical.
All right, I'll buy that.
But he's no artist. He's a technician. But a man who has an emotional substance, who has something emotional to say, and has a vocabulary, if it's a vocabulary of colors, or tones, or words, he expresses his emotion through his technique. And if he has a great technique and feels deeply, he's an artist. Then he's made art. Now, we get back to this inspiration thing. He's fallen in love with a redhead.
Nice thing to do.
This is fine. We all approve of this. But what has he got to say about it? He isn't going to express himself in a drunken stupor at all. Because if he has any technique, he's going to lose it. What he needs is a carefully conceived technique with which to express an emotion that is big enough to wreck him. And these two things have to go together, or else you don't have an artist and you don't have an art.
Jake, it really is interesting looking back when you realize the fantastic run that Oklahoma had, which established a record on Broadway, that you and Oscar had so much difficulty in getting backers for it. Why do you think that was so?
I think that if you look at the lineup of Oklahoma and the people connected with it, there wasn't anything very inviting about it. A tremendous record of failure.
Who are you speaking about specifically?
Everybody connected with the show, you'll forgive me, except me. I had had 10 very, very good years with Larry.
You sure did.
But everybody else had had 10 horrible years, if they had had any.
Yes.
Well, take it apart. It only takes a second. The Theatre Guild had had a list of failures, and this was their last try. This doesn't come from me, this comes from them. I've heard them say it, it's been in print over their names. This is the last gasp for the Theatre Guild. So this is not very conducive to an investor to put his money in the show. Oscar hadn't had a hit in almost 11 years. Mamoulian, no success for a long time. I think the last one was Porgy and Bess.
Which was in 36.
36, and this is now 43.
Yeah.
Agnes DeMille had done nothing. She was a nice little choreographer, but she had never done a Broadway show, and that was that. We had no stars. We had a nice boy by the name of Alfred Drake. Very few people had ever heard of him. Joan Roberts, nothing. Celeste Holm, very little.
12 parts failure and 1 part success.
That's right. So your man with the money looked at this lineup and said, these people have to fail. Then it went even further than that. What was it about? What was then known in radio parlance as a horse opera. This is about cowboys and farmers. Nothing spicy in it. The girls had to wear very long dresses. It also went up to their necks.
You defeated yourself on both ends.
Well, there was nothing awfully attractive about it. And then on top of that, Oscar and I were working together for the first time. Who knew whether this combination would work or not? They were sure in my case that it wouldn't.
Why?
Because I'd had all these years with Hart, and suddenly came the split. They knew that I had to fail. Well, it's theatrical, I suppose, fairly human superstition. This scared an awful lot of money away. I know one moving picture company that ran away from it for that very reason. And you can't argue people out of that attitude.
Not before the fact.
Not before the fact. Post facto, it's a cinch.
As I asked you before about your technique in writing music to set forth characterization, in South Pacific particularly, both with DeBeck, with Nellie, with Cable.
Either a characterization or a situation, which would be composed of character, of course. You'd get two people like Cable, the young lieutenant, and the native girl, Leah, a very young, rather naive people. The girl, tremendously innocent. And if you wanted these two people to sing, I think that what you would give them to sing would necessarily have the feeling of youth and innocence. Here's an example of what I mean. It's almost childlike.
It is an incredible innocence about the quality of that music.
Now, we both felt that this is essential to the dramatic validity of these characters, especially in the situation in which we found them, which sort of bristled with overtones. If you had given them the tune of Some Enchanted Evening, a big, husky, robust love song would have been inappropriate and would have given, I think, a bad slant to the whole thing. This is part of a decorating job.
And in the case of DeBeck?
Well, DeBeck was a much more sophisticated man. He was the Frenchman who read Marcel Proust. He knew a few things. He knew much more than Nellie. It certainly expresses his feeling for romance, at least I hope it does. And it tells the sort of man he is from the viewpoint of love.
No, but there is a robustness even to the romance.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Which was essential for projecting that character. And then with Nellie Forbush, now here you have a rare opportunity in establishing motion and lightness in a character.
Well, you'd get that in a song like I'm in Love with a Wonderful Guy. There's the use of the word guy, which the Frenchman would never use, which Cable, yes, I guess Princeton boys use the word guy a great deal. But from the viewpoint of theater, this wouldn't illustrate the character as well as Guy illustrates the character of Nellie Forbush, the girl from Arkansas. And you give it that kind of music, in its own way, rather naive, but again robust.
That's hardly a static character.
That's right. Well, Nellie wasn't. Very dynamic, young, and an easy-going girl. And you can say these things musically.
Now you had a different problem with Bloody Mary.
Well, Bloody Mary had a number of sides. She was bawdy, and at the same time deeply romantic, and attached to her roots. And the roots were in the islands.
Yes, exactly.
Ballyhigh, you get a dissonance there which is suggestive of the area and suggestive of her own difficulties with herself. So anxious to do the right thing with her daughter, which is how the daughter and the lieutenant got together. They're introduced by Bloody Mary, you see.
Then, of course, you had a sort of overall musical panacea for the sailors.
Well, here again, you had to have muscles, and you also had to have their restlessness. The fact that they were stuck on an island out in the Pacific and didn't have any girls. And if you gave them something like There's Nothing Like a Dame to sing, you had to match it musically. So what do? You start out with a shock. These things are fun to do, and they work tremendously well with an audience if you do your job.
In The King and I, you had to set a rather sustained Oriental mood and quality throughout the play, and yet set it in such a way that Occidental audiences could appreciate it. As a matter of fact, if you had written what we know and understand to be Oriental music, it wouldn't have fit at all, would it?
Oh, I think it'd be terrible. It'd be terrible to an Occidental ear. There'd be no understanding, there'd be no emotional response to it. So the only solution to the problem is to use the medium with which we're acquainted, you and I, and the audience, which is our scale, the Western scale, Western harmonizations with an inflection, the Siamese inflection, not even an accent. Just the suggestion of Oriental. It could have been anything, really. I don't imagine there was any composer in the history of music who was less Japanese than Puccini.
Hardly.
But he wrote the big Japanese opera, didn't he?
Dick, the office that you and Oscar run is probably the easiest major production office for people to get into for a hearing of any in the country.
Yes, I think it is. It's by far the easiest way to live. For me and for Oscar, it would be a very difficult thing for me to have a closed door, not to see young people, not to arrange my office so that young people are heard. Intuitively, I would rebel against that sort of organization. Then there's another phase of it that's completely selfish. I want people to come into my office because I want the people. I do a new show. I can't depend on Ethel Merman always. I can't depend on Mary Martin always. Somebody must replace Mary Martin eventually. Not now, thank goodness. But somewhere there's some little girl who's going to be the Mary Martin of 15 years from now. I would like to avail myself of this talent, and you can put it on a completely selfish basis.
Your selfishness, both with Larry as well as with Oscar, has already produced people like this in the theater. Alfred Drake. Do you remember the circumstances that brought Drake to the forefront?
Yes, I do, but I'm not sure that you do. Are you thinking of Oklahoma?
No.
Oh,
I was going back to 37.
Well, Babes in Arms.
Exactly.
Yes, well, Alfred was a little boy and sang a song called Babes in Arms in that show. Got him his first real attention, I think.
Gene Kelly.
Gene Kelly had been in The Time of Your Life in a bit. But we saw him in that and gave him the lead in Pal Joey.
And that was responsible for his going to Hollywood and then...
Yes, he went right from Pal Joey to Hollywood, although I warned him that he'd never be a success out there.
Mm-hmm.
He went anyway.
Desi Arnaz, that's going back into history.
Yes, well, now that was pretty new. That was in Too Many Girls.
Mm-hmm. That was back in 39. Celeste Holm.
Celeste had done quite a bit of work, but in dramatic shows.
And she hadn't developed too much of a name by the time you...
Oh, no, she was not a name. I knew about her because you know about people in the business. It's your job professionally to know people. But she had never been in a musical show. I guess I was the first person to let her sing professionally.
Well, Oklahoma fixed her, didn't it?
That fixed her good.
I'm really going to take you back now, Dick. with a girl named Harriet Lake.
Yes, Harriet Lake I remember very, very well, in a show called America's Sweetheart.
1931.
That's right. She did well. She was very good in the show, and she too went to Hollywood.
Who changed the name?
I have no idea, but suddenly I went in to see a picture because I'd heard that there was a very good girl in it by the name of Ann Sothern. And it turned out to be our Harriet.
I remember working with Yul Brynner back at CBS, where he was a producer.
That's right.
This was around, I think, in the late 40s. Next thing I know, he's being billed as a featured player in The King and I.
Well, he was sent around to our casting director, and we knew nothing about Yul at all. As a matter of fact, that day, we had lunch with a man we were very anxious to get for the part. Very pleasant lunch, but he had other commitments, and he was afraid they couldn't be worked out, and we were afraid they couldn't, too. We paid the check and got in a cab and went down to the Majestic Theater and out into the auditorium. They were ready to begin with the auditions and told us the name of the first man. And out he came with a bald head and sat cross-legged on the floor of the stage. He had a guitar, and he hit the guitar one whack and gave out with this unearthly yell, sang some heathenish sort of thing. And Oscar and I looked at each other and said, well, that's it. And that was Yul. You didn't have to be awfully smart to know he was great.
Do you think every producer would have been willing to settle for an actor or a performer who was not a name?
Any producer in his right mind.
Well, how many? Now you're begging the question of how many producers are in their right minds.
I don't know. Most of them aren't successful. But this is also true of the silk business.
You and Oscar both, to a marked degree, appear to be far more interested in young people and developing new talent, I think, than any other two people I know of in show business. Is there anything consciously, Dick, that moves you and Oscar to have this tremendous interest in young people and in a desire to develop new talent all the time?
No, it's a curious thing that I think is pretty well built in with both of us. And I think it's a pretty firm leaning in the direction of continuity. You want to continue yourself. There's a desire to pass on. This is where scholarships come from, scholarship funds come from.
Exactly.
The desire to continue. You want to continue yourself with your children just in having them. You want to continue yourself with your work. And I think the interest in other people's children and other people's children's work is simply an extension of that same drive.
Dick, when did you first become aware of the fact that you had cancer?
Oh, on a Friday, and I was operated on Wednesday.
So you only had 4 or 5 days' time in which to think about it?
That's right.
And this was when, Dick, in 53?
53. No, wait a minute. I was 53. It was 2.5 years ago.
Oh, 55. If you were born in 1902, then it must have been 55.
Yeah, it was 55.
So at the age of 53, you had suddenly been told, or you gathered. How did it happen, by the way?
The doctor told me.
He just told you point blank?
Sure. He said, you got it.
Did you reel under the impact of this thing?
No, I was good and scared. He said, we're not getting this too early, and it isn't too late. And then being examined, x-rays, general examination, until I went into the hospital, which is on Tuesday, the following Tuesday, the day that Pipe Dream went into rehearsal. And I spent what free time I had away from the doctors over that weekend finishing up the score. I had another number to write, which I wrote, and I had some composed things to put on paper. I hadn't made the manuscripts, and I did that over the weekend, too.
I'm surprised in a way that the doctor would have come right out and told you forthrightly that you had cancer in your jaw region. Had he discussed this with Dorothy before?
No. No, he told us both at the same time.
Oh, she was there?
She was there. After he examined me, we went into his consulting room, and he just told me what it was. He said, we better do this as quickly as possible. If you give me the green light on Monday, we'll put you in the hospital on Tuesday and do you on Wednesday.
Well, up to the age of 53, you had heard so much about the enemy known as cancer.
Yeah.
So that you must have had a rather latent, if not subconscious, attitude about the whole problem of cancer.
I was afraid of it, as too many people are, and fortunately, all the right things were done. I think even your question was answered properly. Why was I told? You know, a lot of people have asked me that. Did I think that was a good idea? Well, I'm sure, I would have suspected, to the extent that I would have been in enormous conflict about the whole thing, had I not been told the truth. I would have wondered. I would have been more scared that way. At least I knew I was being told the worst.
Now, how did you react, if you remember, immediately to the fact that somebody had told you the worst?
First, I had to go to be x-rayed. Then went back to the apartment and had some lunch with Dorothy. And I can't say I enjoyed it.
No, I'm sure she didn't either.
But a curious thing happened to me. I got a little angry, and mostly I got determined. I got very tough, and she was terribly upset, much more so than I was.
Well, she loves you more than you do.
Yes. She doesn't know me as well. And I remember exactly what I said to her. I said, I'm going to lick this.
Now, how did you know you were going to lick it?
I was just determined to lick it. Now, this is foolish, and I know I had no control, except that too many doctors have told me that determination has a great deal to do with recovery. That the fellow who goes into the operating room licked usually is. And I simply wouldn't have any part of it. The fright is so much worse than the actuality. Fear did not get in my way. Plus a very curious thing that I'm sure you've encountered, most of us have, that in the critical moment, the importance of fear is lessened. That in the time of crisis, we behave enormously well, as individuals, as nations, as families. You get hit very badly and you behave well. Maybe later, the emotional factor takes over. But at the moment of crisis, there's usually amazingly good behavior.
You were faced then, weren't you, with the possibility of this enemy known as cancer killing you?
Oh, sure. But I simply refused the concept of death. I wouldn't have it. I didn't have it. I know that many years ago, I used to discuss with my friends during the war the possibility of New York being bombed by the Germans. And I used to say it won't be bombed. Now, why did I say that? Because I didn't want it to be bombed. I used to make a pretty accurate diagnosis of people at parties. I could tell you a great deal about their personalities, about the way they conducted their business, by whether they thought New York was going to be bombed or not. The self-destructive people said they're sure to come over. They're going to come over and they're going to bomb us. And sooner or later, I became convinced that these people wanted to be bombed because they had no knowledge. No one had any knowledge. Nobody knew one way or the other. I just happened to be right, but I know that I wanted desperately to be right. I didn't want New York to be bombed. And then 2.5 years ago, I didn't want to die. And I didn't want to very, very deeply.
And you got the determination and strength to keep you from dying.
Well, I think I got a very good doctor. And I think I helped him a great deal. He thinks so.
Dick, I'd like to talk to you about two sides of a coin. One failure and the other success. Apart from you and Oscar, all during your career with Larry, where you had one success on top of another, I wonder how much this conditioned your more or less expectancy of a sustained success.
Oh, I don't think it did. I know that always I have not been able to take the success of the next show for granted. If you get up at bat often enough, you're going to strike out.
Well, who was it who said nobody cheered when Babe Ruth hit a double?
Yeah, well, it sounds like Oscar.
I don't know. I never heard Oscar say it. It's a good line, though.
It is, and it's absolutely true. You ask too much of people who've been successful, and that's only human, too. I'm tremendously worried right this minute about the next show. And this isn't because Pipe Dream only ran 1 year instead of 5. It's a natural wariness about the nature of the business. It's very easy to fail. And I've always known that. Oklahoma didn't make me think for 1 second that we weren't vulnerable. I'd be an idiot to think that.
Yeah, but lots of people succumb to that kind of thing, and you can't call them idiots. I don't think you'd have been an idiot to have been impressed by the enormous success of Oklahoma and what followed it.
My point is this, that if you're reasonably rational
It's a tall order.
and have any objectivity, you know that after you've had Oklahoma, State Fair, and Carousel in a row, this is a very good time to be cautious. This is when it's liable to sneak up from behind and hit you on the back of the head. This is why I say it'd be foolhardy to sit back and say, well, I wrote some enchanted evening. Therefore, I must have another big hit in my next score. I mustn't do anything of the kind.
Well, then, is what you're telling me the fact that the pressures of either success or failure are not likely to weigh too heavily on you?
Yes, I'm telling you that. I don't think they do.
If success or failure isn't going to damage either you or Oscar too much from here on in, what specifically is the excitement that the future holds for you, Dick?
I would like to write and produce a good show next year. I would like it to be well received, just as my wife likes to look nice when we go out. This is my ambition.